The story begins in the dust of a forgotten hill outside Jerusalem. The air was heavy with the scent of iron and blood, the sun burning high above a restless crowd. Rome had crucified thousands before, but this one was different. The empire did not yet know it, but on that spring afternoon in the reign of Tiberius, it had sown the seed of its own transformation. The hammer struck the nails, and a Galilean carpenter was raised between two thieves, mocked by soldiers, watched by priests, and silently observed by a few trembling followers. To Rome, it was routine justice. To those who stood weeping at the foot of the cross, it was the death of hope itself. Rome was an empire of gods and conquerors, its cities filled with marble temples and the smoke of sacrifices. Jupiter thundered above the Capitoline Hill, Venus smiled from her shrines, and the emperor himself, wrapped in purple and gold, was honored as a living deity. Religion in Rome was not faith, it was loyalty. To worship was to belong, to deny was to rebel. And so the followers of this crucified man, whispering of his resurrection, were already a danger. Not because of what they believed, but because they dared to believe differently. In the years after the execution, stories began to spread like sparks across dry grass. They spoke of an empty tomb, of a stone rolled away, of a teacher who had conquered death. The Roman authorities barely noticed at first. Judea was a troublesome corner of the empire, always producing prophets and rebels. But this one would not fade. Fishermen became preachers, slaves became apostles, and the words of the crucified man, "Love your enemies, bless those who persecute you," began to echo through the marketplaces and alleys of the empire's greatest cities. At first, the Romans laughed. A god who died on a cross. Madness. The cross was the symbol of shame, of criminals and traitors. How could divinity dwell in defeat? To the Romans, power was divine. To the Christians, divinity was humble. It was a worldview that made no sense, and yet it grew. In the catacombs beneath the streets of Rome, in secret gatherings within the tenements of the poor, this strange new faith began to take root. The empire's power was unmatched, its legions stretching from the misty frontiers of Britannia to the burning sands of Arabia. But beneath the marble and might, Rome was weary. The old gods had lost their grip. The rituals of Jupiter and Mars no longer stirred the soul. The philosophers spoke of virtue and order, yet the streets teemed with corruption, the palaces with fear. Emperors rose and fell by the sword, each claiming divine favor, each crushed by the same endless cycle of blood and betrayal. Into this emptiness crept the words of the apostles, simple, radical, dangerous. They spoke of a kingdom not of this world, of a ruler who served rather than ruled. To the slaves of Rome it was freedom, to the poor it was hope, to the emperors it was treason. Nero would be the first to see it clearly. In the year 64, fire consumed the heart of Rome. Flames licked at the temples and forums, devouring the wooden homes that lined the narrow streets. For 6 days the city burned. Rumors spread like smoke. Some whispered that the emperor himself had ordered it, that he had played his lyre while the capital burned. To divert the fury of the people, Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one in the Christians. They were easy to hate, strange and secretive, accused of cannibalism for their eating of the body and blood, and of impiety for refusing to honor the gods. Nero's persecution was brutal. Crucifixions, burnings, wild beasts in the arena. The historian Tacitus wrote that their deaths were spectacles of cruelty, their bodies torn by dogs or set alight as torches in the imperial gardens. But instead of dying, the faith multiplied. Blood became the seed of belief. As the decades passed, the empire continued to crush the followers of Christ, yet each martyrdom seemed to strengthen them. Paul of Tarsus was executed under Nero's reign, Peter crucified upside down on the Vatican Hill. But their words endured, carried by travelers, merchants, and missionaries along the empire's vast network of roads. In the marketplaces of Antioch and Corinth, in the courts of Alexandria and Carthage, small congregations began to form. People of every tongue and station united not by birth or law, but by faith. By the 2nd century, Christianity was no longer a handful of outcasts. It had become a movement, organized, disciplined, and resilient. The emperors, from Domitian to Marcus Aurelius, tried to extinguish it, but it was like trying to crush smoke. The more the Christians were hunted, the more they seemed to multiply. In the amphitheaters, lions tore at their flesh, yet they sang as they died. The crowds, once entertained, began to feel unease. Who were these people who faced death with such serenity? What power sustained them? Legends arose, of Thecla, a woman who defied her family to follow Paul, and of Perpetua, a young noblewoman of Carthage who faced the beasts with calm defiance. Stories of visions, miracles, and healings spread across the empire, weaving history with myth. To some, these were tales of madness. To others, proof that the Christian God was real. Meanwhile, Rome itself was changing. The old religion had become ritual without meaning. The empire was vast but fragile, stretched thin, its borders under constant attack. Soldiers brought home foreign gods. Philosophers debated the nature of the divine. Amid this confusion, the Christians offered something Rome had lost, a sense of purpose, of moral certainty, of belonging. Still, the faith remained outlawed. The emperors feared its growing strength, especially its refusal to worship the imperial cult. To refuse sacrifice to the emperor's genius was an act of rebellion, a denial of Rome itself. Yet the Christians held firm. "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's," they said, "and to God what is God's." They obeyed the laws, paid their taxes, served in the army, but they would not bow. By the time of Emperor Decius in the mid-3rd century, persecution reached new heights. Christians were forced to sacrifice to the gods or face death. Temples overflowed with terrified citizens pretending loyalty, while others fled to the wilderness. Yet even in the catacombs, the faithful continued to meet. The walls of those dark tunnels still bear the symbols they carved: the fish, the anchor, the chiro, signs of a faith that refused to die. The empire that had once ruled the world now trembled. Plague, invasion, and civil war tore it apart, and in that chaos the Christians endured. They cared for the sick when others fled, buried the dead when others hid. Their compassion became their greatest weapon. Pagan observers began to take notice. "See how they love one another," they said. The empire of conquest had met an empire of conscience. As the 3rd century drew to a close, Rome's gods seemed silent. The sacrifices went unanswered, the oracles grew still. The empire was searching for meaning, and soon it would find it in the very faith it had tried to destroy. The stage was set for a new age, one that would change not only Rome but the world itself. And so the story of the cross, once a symbol of shame, began its slow ascent toward the throne of the Caesars. The blood of martyrs had watered its roots, and the empire that crucified Christ would soon kneel before him. But this transformation would not come through peace alone. It would come through ambition, politics, and visions that blurred the line between heaven and earth. The man who would change everything had not yet risen, but his shadow was already forming. A soldier, a visionary, a conqueror named Constantine. The world into which Constantine was born was weary and wounded. The 3rd century had been a century of chaos, emperors rising and falling like waves, legions turning against their own commanders, barbarians pressing in from the frontiers, plague devouring cities and famine stalking the countryside. The old gods had failed to protect Rome, and their temples, though filled with incense and gold, stood as hollow echoes of former glory. Amid this storm of uncertainty, the empire searched desperately for a savior, and one would appear wearing the purple of a soldier and the mantle of divine destiny. Constantine was born around the year 272 in Naissus, in the province of Moesia, a frontier land between east and west. His father, Constantius, was a capable general who served under Emperor Diocletian, one of the most ruthless reformers in Roman history. Diocletian understood that the empire had grown too vast for one man to rule, and so he divided it, 2 emperors, 2 juniors, ruling together in a system known as the Tetrarchy. It brought order for a time, but it was an order forged in fear. Diocletian sought not just to rebuild Rome's strength, but to restore its soul. He revived the ancient gods, rebuilt temples, and demanded loyalty through worship. To him, the unity of religion and state was the lifeblood of empire. and so in the year 303 he unleashed what would become the most brutal persecution of Christians in Roman history. Churches were torn down, scriptures burned, and believers hunted across the provinces. Torture, execution, and exile followed. The gods of Rome demanded blood, and Diocletian gave it freely. But persecution had the opposite effect. The faith, now centuries old, had roots too deep to die. It survived underground, in whispers and secret meetings, and among the soldiers and administrators of the empire, even within the legions themselves, Christianity quietly spread. When Constantine was young, he must have seen both sides, the cruelty of imperial religion and the quiet courage of the persecuted. When Diocletian abdicated and retired to his palace at Split, the empire once again fractured. Ambition, that ancient Roman god, reasserted his rule. Generals turned on generals, pretenders rose and fell, and the great contest for the throne began anew. Out of this chaos, Constantine emerged, shrewd, charismatic, and relentless. By 312, he stood at the gates of Rome itself, facing his final rival, Maxentius. The city that had once ruled the world had become the prize in a civil war. On the eve of battle, as Constantine's troops camped along the Tiber, legend says he looked up to the sky and saw a vision, a cross of light above the sun, and the words in hoc signo vinces, "In this sign you will conquer." Whether it was a dream, a divine revelation, or a carefully crafted piece of imperial propaganda, it would change history forever. The next day, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Chi Rho, the first letters of Christ's name. When the armies clashed, the river ran red, and Maxentius was swept into the water, drowning beneath the weight of his own armor. Constantine entered Rome as victor, hailed by the people as the savior of the city, and for the first time in its 1,000-year history, the empire's supreme ruler bore the sign of the cross. To some this was blasphemy, to others a miracle. Had the Christian God truly granted victory to a Roman emperor? Or had Constantine merely used the faith as a new symbol of unity, a banner under which he could forge his empire anew? History gives no certain answer. But what followed was unmistakable, the dawn of a new world. In 313, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, declaring religious tolerance for all, and ending 3 centuries of persecution. The prisons emptied, the churches reopened, and the faith that had survived in darkness stepped into the light. Bishops emerged from hiding, martyrs were honored as heroes. For the first time, Christianity was not the enemy of Rome, but its partner. And yet, the union was uneasy. Christianity had been born in poverty and persecution, a faith of fishermen, slaves, and wanderers. Now it stood beside emperors, clothed in silk and crowned with gold. Temples that once echoed with pagan hymns began to echo with Christian chants. The gods of Olympus faded into silence as crosses rose above the skyline of the eternal city. But beneath this transformation lay tension between humility and power, between heaven and empire. Constantine himself was no simple believer. He was a man of ambition and vision, ruling with both sword and symbol. He saw in Christianity not only a faith, but a force that could bind the empire together. Paganism had splintered into local cults and rival priesthoods, but the Christian church, disciplined, organized, and universal, offered unity. It had bishops instead of priests, councils instead of temples, and a moral code that transcended borders. To cement this unity, Constantine turned eastward. Rome, the ancient capital, had become decadent and decaying, haunted by its own grandeur. In 330, he founded a new city, Constantinople, at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Built on the site of ancient Byzantium, it would shine for 1,000 years as the new Rome, crowned with Christian basilicas and adorned with imperial glory. From its golden domes, the empire would look not to Jupiter but to Christ. Yet even as Constantine built churches and summoned bishops, the faith itself was divided. The early Christians, once united by suffering, now quarreled over doctrine. Was Christ equal to God or created by him? Could he be both divine and human? These were not idle questions. They tore at the heart of belief. The Arian controversy, named after the priest Arius, spread through the empire, threatening to fracture the church before it had even found its footing. Constantine, ever the pragmatist, saw theology as politics by another name. To preserve unity, he called the first great council of the church at Nicaea in 325. Hundreds of bishops gathered, robed in white, many still bearing the scars of persecution. There, under the watchful eye of the emperor, they debated the mysteries of the divine. After weeks of argument, they proclaimed the Nicene Creed, affirming that Christ was of one substance with the Father. Heresy was declared, unity restored, at least in appearance. It was a paradox worthy of Rome itself. The empire that once sought to destroy Christianity had now become its guardian, its sponsor, its stage. The cross that once hung as an instrument of shame now gleamed on imperial banners. The faith of the martyrs had entered the palaces of power, and yet, for all his devotion, Constantine remained a man of this world. He was baptized only on his deathbed, his heart still torn between empire and eternity. As his reign ended, the balance between faith and politics grew ever more fragile. Constantine's sons inherited both his power and his contradictions. Some championed Christianity, others flirted with the old gods. Pagan temples were closed, reopened, and closed again. The empire wavered between two worlds, one fading, one rising. And in the shadows of this transformation, myths began to bloom. Stories spread of visions and miracles, of angels appearing before battle, of emperors dreaming of crosses made of fire. Rome's imagination, once filled with Jupiter's thunderbolts, now turned to the celestial light of Christ. The empire was remaking its own mythology, the crucified God replacing the conqueror God, the martyr replacing the warrior. But beneath this veneer of faith, the struggle was far from over. Many Romans clung to the old ways, unwilling to abandon the gods of their ancestors. Temples still stood, sacrifices still smoked, philosophers still praised the wisdom of Apollo and Athena. For them, Christianity was a barbarian's creed, too simple, too emotional, too foreign. And yet, slowly, inexorably, it spread, through the markets, the schools, the barracks, the imperial court itself. The bishops grew in power, their influence stretching across provinces. The church became not merely a faith but an institution, with its own hierarchy, its own wealth, its own politics. In embracing Rome, Christianity had begun to resemble it. When Constantine died in 337, the empire he left behind was no longer the one he had inherited. The seeds he planted would grow into an empire of the cross, but also into centuries of conflict, reform, and rebirth. The gods of old still lingered in marble and memory, but the future belonged to the followers of Christ. Rome had not yet fully converted, but the tide was irreversible. The legions still marched under eagles, but above them gleamed the cross. The Senate still met beneath statues of Jupiter, but their sons were baptized in the name of the Trinity. The world had shifted, quietly, profoundly, forever. The crucified had conquered. But the story of how faith would reshape the empire, and how the empire in turn would reshape the faith, was only just beginning. For the next century would see Rome's final transformation, from a city of 1,000 gods to the heart of a single eternal church. When Constantine's body was laid in the Church of the Holy Apostles, his coffin gleamed with imperial gold, surrounded by 12 empty thrones, one for each of Christ's apostles. In that moment, a symbol of astonishing audacity was born. The emperor, the once living god of Rome, now resting among the servants of a crucified carpenter. The fusion was complete, at least in ceremony. His sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, fought one another as bitterly as any pagan pretenders before them. Each draped himself in the banner of heaven, but their wars were fought with the same ancient ambition that had always fueled Rome's blood. While the empire tore itself apart, the question of faith became not merely spiritual, but political. Christianity had become the new language of power, and whoever claimed divine favor could claim the throne. Constantius II, cold and austere, leaned toward the Arian creed, the belief that Christ was subordinate to God. His rule was marked by theological intrigue and ruthless suppression of dissent. In the East, bishops were exiled and reinstated with every imperial whim. Councils met, creeds shifted, and the faithful grew weary of endless disputes. To the common believer, Christ seemed less like a savior than a battlefield. Then came a strange interlude, the last gasp of the old gods. He was the nephew of Constantine, raised as a Christian but educated in the philosophy of Greece. Where his forebears saw faith as a tool of unity, Julian saw it as a betrayal of Rome's soul. He revered the pagan philosophers, Plato, Plotinus, and the ancient oracles, and dreamed of restoring the old religion to its rightful glory. He reopened the temples, restored the priesthoods, and offered sacrifices to Jupiter once more. He mocked the Christians as Galileans, accusing them of twisting philosophy into superstition. Yet even as he raised the altars, the flame of paganism flickered weakly. The gods who had ruled for 1,000 years no longer stirred the hearts of the people. The temples, though cleaned and gilded, stood like tombs of a forgotten faith. Julian sought to rebuild not merely the religion of Rome, but its spirit, the old Roman virtues, the pride and discipline of the ancient republic. But the world had changed. The old virtues had turned to marble statues, admired but lifeless. Christianity, with its promise of salvation and its moral certainty, had captured something paganism could not: the soul's hunger for eternity. When Julian fell in battle against the Persians in 363, legend says his dying words were bitter: "You have conquered, O Galilean." After his death, the old gods fell silent forever. The emperors who followed were Christians, imperfect, worldly, and often brutal, but undeniably loyal to the new faith. Under Valentinian in the west and Valens in the east, the empire tried to balance tradition and change. Pagan festivals were still celebrated, temples still maintained, but the tide was turning. The bishops, once fugitives, now wielded influence greater than senators. The church, disciplined and expanding, had become a power equal to the throne. Then in 379 a man rose who would complete the transformation: Theodosius of Hispania. Stern, devout, and relentless, he would become known as Theodosius the Great. To him, Christianity was not merely tolerated, it was truth. In 380, Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, declaring Christianity, specifically the Nicene Creed, the official religion of the empire. All other forms of worship, including paganism and heretical sects, were forbidden. The gods of old were outlawed not by sword, but by decree. Jupiter was no longer a god, merely a memory. The temples that had stood for centuries began to close their doors. Statues were toppled, altars smashed, the sacred fires extinguished. In Alexandria, the great Serapeum, the towering temple of Serapis, became the final stronghold of the old religion. Its defenders, philosophers, and priests barricaded themselves within its walls, praying to the old gods for deliverance. When the Christian soldiers broke through, they found the idol of Serapis towering above them, radiant, majestic, carved from ivory and gold. With one blow they shattered its face. The pieces fell, and the crowd outside erupted in cheers. It was the symbolic death of paganism. Columns that once supported the sanctuaries of Apollo now upheld basilicas dedicated to Christ. The marble faces of the gods were defaced, their names erased. The city of Rome, once the city of 1,000 deities, began to echo with the toll of church bells and the chants of priests. The pagan priests faded into obscurity, their sacred rites replaced by processions, incense, and hymns. The transformation was total, but it came at a price. The empire that once embraced every faith now demanded one. Heretics were persecuted, pagans hunted, philosophers silenced. The faith that had once preached peace now wielded the sword of authority. Bishops denounced rivals, mobs destroyed temples, and the church learned the language of power. Theodosius himself would become both defender and destroyer. When he ordered the massacre of thousands in Thessalonica after a riot, the Bishop Ambrose of Milan barred him from entering the church until he repented publicly, a moment that symbolized the new world. The emperor, kneeling before the altar power, humbled by conscience. For the first time in history, Spiritual authority had eclipsed imperial might. Yet even as Christianity triumphed, Rome herself began to crumble. The Visigoths and Vandals pressed against the borders, the legions thinned, and the empire's heart grew weak. Some whispered that the anger of the old gods had brought this upon them. Pagan writers like the noble Symmachus pleaded for tolerance, arguing that Rome's greatness had come from honoring many gods, not one, but their voices were drowned out by the chorus of bishops and believers. The city of Rome, now filled with crosses and saints, was no longer the center of the world. The imperial court had moved east to Constantinople, a city that gleamed with Christian domes and golden mosaics, a vision of heavenly order on earth. The West, neglected and fading, would soon fall into shadow, but the faith that now ruled it would endure. When Theodosius died in 395, the empire was divided for the last time, east and west, two halves of a once great whole. His sons inherited thrones already cracking beneath their weight. Within 15 years, Alaric the Goth would march on Rome. In 410, the Eternal City was sacked. The unthinkable had happened. The capital of the world had fallen. To many Romans, it was the ultimate proof that the gods they had abandoned had turned their backs. How could Christ protect the empire that had embraced him? Pagan critics mocked the Christians, saying, "Where is your God now?" And in response, a bishop from North Africa, a scholar named Augustine, began to write the book that would redefine the meaning of empire itself. His City of God would argue that Rome's collapse was not the failure of Christianity, but of earthly ambition. The true kingdom, he said, was not of this world. Empires rise and fall, but the city of God endures forever. In those words, the meaning of history itself shifted. No longer was Rome the measure of eternity. Now eternity judged Rome. The old empire had fallen, but from its ruins a new one was taking shape, not of marble and legions, but of faith and memory. The bishops, not the generals, now held the destiny of the West. The church became Rome's heir, inheriting its language, its law, its architecture, even its ambition. The world had changed hands, from the Caesars to the saints. The transformation was complete in form, if not in heart. The temples of Jupiter were now cathedrals. The festivals of Saturn became feasts of saints. Even the myths of old were reborn, the Virgin replacing Venus, the martyrs taking the place of heroes. Rome had not so much died as it had been baptized. The same grandeur that had once worshipped Jupiter now knelt before the cross. The eternal city remained eternal. Only the names of its gods had changed. But in that change, something new had been born. An empire not of conquest but of conviction, not ruled by the sword but by the Spirit. The Rome that once crucified Christ had learned to worship him, and in doing so had reshaped the course of civilization. Yet this was not the end of the story. The faith that had conquered the empire would now have to survive the empire's fall, to preserve light in a world descending into darkness, to carry memory through the ruin of ages. For ahead lay centuries of chaos and creation, when monks would guard the wisdom of the ancients, and the church, seated on the ruins of Rome, would become the heart of a new world. The empire had fallen, but the dream of Rome refused to die. Its marble palaces lay in ruins, its legions scattered, its emperors forgotten, but its spirit found refuge in the one institution that still stood unbroken: the Church. In the dark centuries that followed the fall, when barbarians roamed the fields and cities turned to dust, the faith that had once crept through catacombs became the backbone of a new world. The city of Rome, humbled and half-deserted, now echoed not with the march of legions but with the solemn hymns of monks. The forum was silent, the Senate gone, but in the basilicas rose the voices of priests chanting in Latin, preserving the tongue of empire as a sacred language. The Bishop of Rome, once a humble shepherd among many, began to wear the mantle of lost Caesars. People now looked not to the emperor in Constantinople, but to the man in the Lateran palace, the Pope, the successor of Peter. The transition was not planned, it was born of necessity. The empire's structures had crumbled, but the church's order remained. Its bishops governed where governors no longer ruled. Its monasteries became refuges of peace amid the anarchy of kingdoms. In their scriptoria, monks copied not only the Gospels, but the works of Cicero, Virgil, and Aristotle. In saving the word of God, they also saved the words of Rome. Through those centuries of shadow, faith became the fire that would not go out. The barbarian kings who carved their realms from the corpse of empire, Goths, Vandals, Lombards, Franks, all came as conquerors and left as Christians. Some converted by persuasion, others by the slow alchemy of contact. Missionaries traveled northward, crossing forests and rivers, bringing with them relics, crosses, and the promise of salvation. In the ruins of amphitheaters, new altars rose. In pagan groves, monasteries bloomed like outposts of eternity. But the Church's triumph was never merely spiritual, it was political. In a world without empire, it became the empire. Its authority extended beyond borders, its bishops wielding influence kings envied. Yet it was not a kingdom of soldiers but of symbols. The cross became the new standard, the relic, the new scepter. Miracles replaced battles, saints replaced heroes, and martyrs replaced generals. Legends took root in the soil of Europe like seeds from the old world. They said that Peter himself had walked the streets of Rome, and that his bones rested beneath the Vatican Hill, guarding the city as Jupiter once had. Pilgrims came from every corner of the world to kneel at his tomb, their footsteps weaving new roads of devotion where Roman roads had once led legions. Rome, it was said, had not lost its destiny. It had only changed its crown. The bishops of Rome began to assert their primacy, tracing an unbroken line from Peter to themselves. In an age when crowns were won by the sword, theirs was won by sanctity. The Pope became the heir to empire, ruling not by decree but by blessing, not through armies but through faith. When barbarian kings quarreled, they sought the Pope's counsel. When nations were born, they sought his approval. But the story of how Rome became Christian was not only the story of faith's victory, it was also the story of how power remade faith. The Church inherited Rome's ambition as well as its sanctity. The Roman genius for administration, for hierarchy, for order, became the Church's strength. Bishops became administrators of divine provinces, councils replaced senates, and canon law replaced imperial edict. The old imperial dream, the rule of a single order over a diverse world, was reborn in sacred form. Even the imagery of empire returned, now baptized. Christ was hailed as Dominus, the Lord of Lords. Heaven was a city with gates and walls, ruled by a divine emperor. Angels stood as his legions. The Roman sense of majesty had found new expression in theology. The empire had not ended, it had ascended. As centuries passed, new empires rose upon the foundation of faith. In the East, the Byzantine emperors ruled from Constantinople, where golden domes reflected the light of heaven. Their court shimmered with ritual, a mirror of celestial order. The emperor was both Caesar and priest, his rule sanctified by divine will. In Hagia Sophia, the great church of holy wisdom, light itself seemed to descend from heaven, pouring through the dome's windows like grace upon stone. In the West, however, darkness deepened before dawn. The fall of Rome had left a vacuum that barbarian chieftains filled but could not control. The Franks under Clovis, the first of their kings to be baptized, offered a glimpse of renewal. When the waters of baptism touched his brow, the Church gained not just a convert but an ally. From that union of crown and cross would grow the medieval world. By the 8th century, a new power threatened from the south, the armies of Islam, fierce and swift, proclaiming their own vision of divine empire. They conquered lands that had once been Roman, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, even Spain. The crescent rose where the cross had shone. Christendom found itself encircled, its survival uncertain. But in adversity, it found strength. In 800, on Christmas Day, in the old Basilica of St. Peter's, a new emperor knelt before the Pope. He was Charles, King of the Franks, Charlemagne. As he bowed, the Pope placed a crown upon his head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. In that instant, the old empire was reborn, not as a realm of marble and eagles, but as the Holy Roman Empire. Rome's dream had outlived Rome itself. Under Charlemagne's rule, faith became culture, law, and learning. Monasteries became centers of education, scriptoria buzzed with quills, and the flame of classical knowledge flickered back to life. Latin, the language of Caesar, became the language of God. The empire of faith had assumed the mantle of civilization, carrying forward the heritage of 1,000 years. And yet, the fusion of faith and power was a dangerous gift. The Church, once persecuted for its purity, now wielded earthly dominion. Kings were crowned and excommunicated at its whim. Gold and relics filled its treasuries. The humility of Galilee had become the splendor of Rome. In the cathedrals that now pierced the heavens, faith reached upward in stone and glass. But beneath the beauty lay the same ambition that had once driven the Caesars, to rule forever. Still, even amid power, the Church remained the guardian of mystery. In its rituals echoed the old Roman pageantry, in its incense the scent of ancient sacrifice. The people no longer prayed to Jupiter or Mars, but to saints who had become their new patrons, George the warrior, Catherine the wise, Peter the gatekeeper. Christianity had not erased the mythic imagination of Rome. It had absorbed it. The gods had been baptized, transformed into holy figures who carried divine stories into a new age. Pilgrimages replaced triumphal processions, relics replaced trophies, and faith replaced empire as the center of the world. The eternal city, once the seat of temporal dominion, became the heart of spiritual sovereignty. And through the ages, it endured. Rome's transformation had not been a single event but a metamorphosis, a long, slow alchemy of power, faith, and legend. The empire of marble became an empire of belief. The legions of soldiers were replaced by legions of monks and priests, and the crucified man, once condemned as a rebel, now ruled from heaven as Emperor Eternal. As the first millennium approached, the people of Europe looked to the heavens with fear and wonder. The year 1000 was seen as both promise and peril, an age when heaven might descend to earth or judgment might consume it. Yet when the dawn came, the world did not end. Instead, it awoke to find itself fully Christian. Every village had its church, every city its cathedral. The rhythm of life was marked by bells and sacraments, by feast and fast. The Roman Empire had perished, but in 1,000 chapels and abbeys its legacy lived on, not as a memory of conquest, but as a kingdom of the Spirit. Rome, the eternal city, had indeed become eternal, not through its emperors, but through its faith. The gods of old had returned to dust, but the word endured, carried in song, scripture, and stone. From the catacombs to the basilicas, from the ruins of empire to the spires of Christendom, the transformation was complete. Yet the story of how Rome became Christian did not end there, for the faith that had conquered the world would face new trials: heresy, schism, crusade, and reform. The empire of the cross would stretch across continents, rise to unimagined heights, and fall into shadow again. But through it all, the spirit of Rome, the will to endure, would live on, reborn in the name of Christ. The bells of Christendom rang across the world, and for a moment it seemed that the empire of the cross had achieved what the empire of Caesar never could: dominion, not through conquest, but through conviction. From the icy fjords of the north to the deserts of Africa, from the emerald hills of Ireland to the gates of Jerusalem, the name of Christ was spoken in 1,000 tongues. Kings ruled by divine right, popes sat enthroned above princes, and cathedrals rose like mountains of faith, their spires piercing the veil between heaven and earth. But power, even sanctified, carries the seeds of corruption. The church that had once defied emperors now wielded a scepter heavier than any Caesar's. Gold gleamed where once there had been humility. Relics were sold as talismans, indulgences bartered for salvation. In the halls of Rome, where Peter's bones were said to rest, ambition whispered again. Cardinals schemed, popes waged wars, and the faith of Christ became entangled once more with the politics of empire. And yet, even amid decay, beauty blossomed. In the 14th and 15th centuries, as Europe stirred from its long medieval slumber, a new light dawned in the very heart of Rome: the Renaissance. Artists, thinkers, and poets returned to the wisdom of Greece and the glory of Rome, seeking to reconcile the world of man with the world of God. The Vatican became both a temple of faith and a gallery of genius. Michelangelo's frescoes stretched across the Sistine ceiling like a vision of creation itself. Raphael's saints moved with the grace of the old Olympians. And beneath St. Peter's dome, designed by Bramante and crowned by Michelangelo, the ancient empire seemed to breathe again in sacred form. Rome was reborn, not as the capital of armies, but as the capital of imagination. The human spirit, once disciplined by dogma, began to dream freely once more. Yet that same freedom would soon fracture unity. The age of Reformation had come. In the 16th century, far from the marble halls of the Vatican, a monk named Martin Luther nailed his challenge to a church door in Wittenberg. His hammer struck more than wood. It cracked the foundation of Christendom itself. The Reformation tore through Europe like a storm. Princes chose sides, nations rose and fell, and faith once more became a battlefield. Rome, once the heart of a universal church, now found itself contested, accused of corruption, pride, and tyranny. But even in the face of rebellion, Rome endured. The Counter-Reformation rekindled its fire. Jesuits carried the gospel across oceans to the New World, to Africa, to Asia, planting the faith in lands Caesar had never dreamed of. Baroque churches rose in gold and marble, radiant with divine drama, as though Rome sought to dazzle the world into belief. In their curves and light, one could still see the echo of imperial grandeur, faith dressed once again in the garments of empire. The centuries turned. Empires rose and fell, Spain, France, Britain, all bearing in some way the legacy of Rome's dream of universality. The idea that the world could be one, under one law, one vision, one God. This was the inheritance of Rome and of Christianity alike. Yet even as Christ's name circled the globe, the modern world began to awaken, questioning, doubting, dissecting the sacred. The Enlightenment stripped heaven of mystery and crowned reason in its place. The power of the church waned, its lands taken, its influence challenged. Still, Rome remained. It had survived Goths and Vandals, schisms and heresies, emperors and reformers. Its endurance was not of marble, but of meaning. The Vatican became a city within a city, the smallest state on earth yet the most symbolically vast, a reminder that faith, once sown in suffering, can outlast the mightiest empires. In 1870, as the new Italian nation seized the Papal States, the Pope withdrew behind his walls, declaring himself a prisoner in the Vatican. It seemed the temporal power of Rome's church was finished, but what the sword took, time restored in spirit. For in that same century, the faith of Rome began to shine anew, not through conquest, but through conscience. Popes became shepherds again, not emperors. Pilgrims returned to St. Peter's Square not as subjects but as seekers. And then, in the 20th century, the century of war and ruin, the paradox of Rome's transformation revealed its full depth. 2 world wars ravaged Europe. Dictators rose and fell. Humanity confronted the abyss of its own violence. The ruins of cities mirrored the ruins of the old empire, and yet through the smoke St. Peter's dome still stood, a sign that something ancient, something enduring, still watched over the world. It was as if the story had come full circle. The empire that once crucified Christ had been reborn as the faith that sought to heal a broken world. Rome, the executioner, had become Rome, the penitent. Its emperors were gone, but its martyrs remained. Its legions were dust, but its prayers ascended still. In the late 20th century, as the Church entered the modern age, new voices arose, popes who traveled the world, speaking not of empire, but of peace. John Paul II stood before millions, preaching in stadiums and city squares, his words echoing across continents. In a world that had outgrown kings, the Pope became a symbol of something beyond politics, a memory of the eternal. And now, as we gaze upon Rome today, we see the ghosts of both worlds, the marble of Caesar and the cross of Christ, the ruins of empire and the basilicas of faith. Tourists walk where centurions marched, pilgrims pray where emperors decreed. The stones remember everything. The Colosseum, once drenched in blood, is now illuminated by candlelight each Easter, the Pope standing before it in silent prayer. The hill where crucifixion was punishment has become the emblem of redemption. The empire that sought to crush one man's faith, ended by embracing his name as its own. It is a story of irony and inevitability, of human frailty and divine persistence. For Rome was always destined for immortality, not through conquest, but through transformation. The same hunger that built its roads and walls, that stretched its dominion to the ends of the earth, found a new expression in the search for eternal truth. What began as an act of violence became an act of faith. The cross, once a weapon of terror, became a bridge between heaven and earth. In the end, perhaps Rome did not convert to Christianity as much as Christianity became Roman, the two fused, entwined, inseparable. The empire gave the church its structure, its language, its sense of destiny. The faith gave the empire its soul. Together they built a civilization that, for all its flaws, would shape the conscience of the world. And so the story closes where it began. In a world of gods and men, of empires and eternity, the carpenter's son who died beneath Roman nails became the cornerstone of Rome's rebirth. His name outlived every emperor's. His kingdom, not of this world, transformed the one that crucified him. Today, as the sun sets over the Tiber and the golden dome of St. Peter's glows in twilight, you can still feel the pulse of that transformation. The whispers of the past mingle with the prayers of the present. The marble breathes. The stones of Rome, once echoing with the cries of gladiators and the chants of pagan priests, now resound with hymns to the one they once condemned. From crucifixion to cathedral, from rebellion to revelation, from empire to eternity. This is the story of how Rome became Christian. A tale not of conquest but of conversion, not of destruction but of transformation. The empire that sought to erase a man's name became the vessel that carried it to the ends of the earth. And perhaps if you stand one evening in the shadow of the Vatican and listen as the bells toll across the city, you will hear not only the sound of faith, but the heartbeat of history itself, the echo of an empire reborn in the name of the man it once crucified, now worshipped as its God.